Have you ever tried to picture what it might be like to open a White House bathroom door only to find a pair of alligators staring back at you? Believe it or not, that exact scenario actually happened, and we're about to take a wild, wonderful, and delightfully strange tour through American history to uncover the truth behind that very question. From the most unconventional companions to the truly inexplicable furry, scaly, and feathery friends, the presidents of the United States have shared their homes with some of the most bizarre pets you could ever imagine. This isn't just a list of animals, it's a journey into the personal lives, eccentricities, and sometimes downright puzzling choices of the leaders who called the White House home. Think about it. Behind every major decision, behind every speech and every bill signed, there were also moments of quiet companionship, unexpected chaos, and genuine affection between these leaders and their often unusual animal friends. Some of these pets were gifts from foreign dignitaries, others were childhood companions that made the move to 160 Pennsylvania Avenue, and a few seem to have been adopted on little more than a whim. What does it say about a president who keeps a raccoon on a leash or a hyena in the garden? How did these creatures shape the atmosphere of the most famous residence in the world? We're going to explore not just the animals themselves, but the stories behind them, the laughter, the surprises, and even the occasional diplomatic incident that arose from having a two-headed turtle or a mischievous bear roaming the halls. So settle in and get ready for a ride through one of the most charmingly odd corners of American history. We've dug deep into archives, personal letters, and long-forgotten anecdotes to bring you the full, fascinating stories of the 30 weirdest presidential pets, each one more surprising than the last. Whether you're an animal lover, a history buff, or just someone who enjoys a great story, this exploration is sure to delight, amuse, and maybe even leave you wondering. What would you have chosen as your presidential pet? And what better way to begin our strange safari than with an animal that perfectly sets the tone for the entire list? Our first entry takes us back to the 1820s and the administration of John Quincy Adams, a man known for his formidable intellect and his rather unconventional houseguest. The story begins with a gift from a revolutionary hero, the Marquis de Lafayette, during his grand tour of the United States in 1825, presented President Adams with a living, breathing testament to American exoticism, a young American alligator. Now, receiving a dangerous reptile might seem like a bizarre present to us today, but in that era, it was a symbol of the nation's vast, untamed wilderness, a curiosity from the New World. And President Adams, never one to do things by halves, decided the most logical place to house this new pet was in the unfinished East Room bathtub. Imagine the scene: a visiting diplomat or a nervous congressman, perhaps needing to freshen up, is directed to the bath chamber only to be met not with warm water and towels, but with the cold, unblinking gaze of a prehistoric reptile lounging in the porcelain. The shock and confusion among White House staff and guests must have been absolutely priceless, a constant source of bewildered whispers and cautious peeks around door frames. Adams, a noted naturalist, likely saw the creature less as a pet and more as a fascinating scientific specimen, a living piece of the American frontier right there in the executive mansion. This wasn't just a quirky anecdote, it was a statement. In housing such a wild, untamable animal within the most refined residence in the country, Adams was subtly weaving the raw, adventurous spirit of the nation into the very fabric of its seat of power. It was a bold, almost whimsical choice that reminds us that even the most serious leaders have a capacity for the wonderfully weird. Moving from the swamps represented in a bathtub to the exotic courts of distant empires, our next stop takes us to the administration of Martin Van Buren, and a gift so spectacularly unusual it almost cost him his political career. In 1837, the Sultan of Oman sent a diplomatic present to the president, a gesture meant to foster goodwill between the two nations. But this wasn't a fine sword or a chest of jewels. It was a pair of magnificent and undoubtedly fearsome tiger cubs. The arrival of these exotic predators in the heart of Washington, D.C. caused an absolute sensation. The public was utterly captivated, thrilled by the idea of their president harboring such dangerous and beautiful creatures right there on the White House grounds. For a brief, thrilling period, the leader of the free world was also the caretaker of two baby tigers, but the reality of caring for two growing carnivores quickly set in. These weren't docile lapdogs, they were wild animals with immense strength and instincts that couldn't be domesticated. The White House staff, already tasked with the immense responsibility of running the executive mansion, now had to become big cat handlers, figuring out how to feed and contain animals that would soon become formidable predators. The cubs were likely housed in a specially built enclosure, but as they grew, the risks became impossible to ignore. The charming cubs would not stay small and manageable for long, and the potential for a disastrous incident was a constant, looming worry. The fascinating story, however, takes a sharp political turn. Van Buren's political opponents, the Whigs, seized upon the tigers as a perfect symbol of what they saw as the president's monarchical and extravagant tendencies. They argued that accepting such a lavish gift from a foreign ruler was unbecoming of a simple Republican leader. It was portrayed as an act of elitism, a sign that Van Buren was out of touch with the common American. The controversy became so heated that it actually reached Congress, where lawmakers debated the legality of the president keeping the gift. Facing intense political pressure and the very real logistical nightmare, Van Buren made the only practical choice he could. The tigers were soon relocated to a zoo, ending one of the shortest-lived and most politically charged pet arrangements in White House history. This episode is a powerful reminder that in the world of the presidency, even a simple act of accepting a gift can become a complex web of diplomacy, public perception, and political gamesmanship. If you thought presidential pets were merely mischievous, wait until you hear about the one that literally crashed a state funeral. Our next entry brings us to the tragically short presidency of William Henry Harrison, a man whose time in office lasted only 31 days, but whose pet animal left a mark on history that was anything but brief. Harrison, the oldest president to take office at the time, arrived in Washington with more than just political ambition. He brought along a billy goat, a creature that served as both a pet and a familiar, rustic reminder of his simpler life back on his farm in North Bend, Ohio. The goat was a common sight on the White House lawn, often seen tethered and grazing peacefully, a living symbol of the president's desire to present himself as a humble man of the people, a frontiersman at heart. It was a carefully crafted image, and the goat played its part perfectly. But this pastoral scene would soon be shattered by tragedy. Just 1 month after delivering his famously long inaugural address in the freezing cold without a hat or coat, President Harrison succumbed to pneumonia. The nation was plunged into mourning, and Washington, D.C. prepared for a grand, solemn state funeral to honor the fallen leader. The procession was a spectacle of grief and pageantry, with marching soldiers, dignitaries in black crepe, and a horse-drawn hearse carrying the president's casket. It was a moment of profound national solemnity, a ritual designed to project dignity and order in the face of loss. And it was at this precise, somber moment that the billy goat decided to make his own contribution to the proceedings. Somehow, the animal broke free from its tether, driven by panic, confusion, or perhaps just pure caprine stubbornness. It charged headlong into the midst of the mourning procession. The effect was instantaneous and chaotic. The dignified silence was broken by shouts of alarm as the goat barreled through the crowd of mourners, scattering startled dignitaries and disrupting the meticulously ordered ranks of the funeral march. The image is almost surreal, a symbol of Harrison's rustic life violently interrupting the formal rituals of his death, injecting a burst of uncontrollable, chaotic life into a ceremony dedicated to honoring its end. It was a moment of profound, if deeply awkward, dark humor that the newspapers of the day eagerly reported, ensuring the tale would be passed down through history. While it's easy to see this as a purely comical footnote, it also serves as a strangely poignant metaphor. The untamable, unpredictable spirit of the natural world, represented by that goat, broke through the strictures of human ceremony in a way that perhaps Harrison himself, the old frontiersman, might have appreciated on some level. It was a final, bizarre farewell from a pet that refused to be sidelined, ensuring that the 9th president would be remembered not only for the brevity of his term but for the unforgettable chaos that followed him even to his grave. Following the chaotic funeral of William Henry Harrison, we journey forward a few decades to an administration known more for its political turmoil than its light-hearted moments, yet it too had its share of bizarre animal magnetism. James Buchanan, the only lifelong bachelor to serve as president, presided over a nation rapidly tearing itself apart in the years leading to the Civil War. His White House was often described as gloomy and tense, a reflection of the deep divisions in the country. It is against this sober backdrop that one of the most fantastical and impractical pet proposals in presidential history arrived, not from a neighboring farm, but from a kingdom on the other side of the globe. In 1857, the King of Siam, hoping to establish stronger ties with the United States, extended a truly royal gift to President Buchanan. It wasn't a mere trinket or a decorative weapon, it was an offer of several working elephants. The king's intention was both practical and symbolic. He believed these magnificent creatures could be used as powerful draft animals on American farms, a novel solution to agricultural labor. The idea of a herd of elephants plowing the fields of Pennsylvania or Virginia is an image so startlingly out of place it feels almost like a scene from a steampunk fantasy novel. The logistics alone are mind-boggling. The climate, the diet, the sheer size and strength of the animals would have made them utterly unsuited for American agriculture, a fact that was likely apparent to everyone except perhaps the well-intentioned king. While the president wisely declined the entire herd, diplomatic protocol of the era often required accepting at least a token of a foreign leader's generosity. And so, for a brief and bewildering period, a single elephant took up residence on the White House grounds. One can only imagine the scene. Amidst the heated debates over states' rights and the fragile Union, the presidential mansion was also home to the constant, quiet rumble of a pachyderm. Its care would have fallen to the stable hands and groundskeepers, who suddenly had to become experts in procuring vast quantities of hay, fruit, and water for a creature that could consume hundreds of pounds of food each day. The elephant's presence was a massive, living, breathing logistical puzzle, a silent, gray giant requiring constant attention. The public reaction was a mixture of sheer delight and utter bewilderment. For many citizens, the elephant was a wondrous curiosity, a living spectacle that offered a momentary escape from the grim political headlines. Newspapers of the time carried stories about the exotic resident, and it undoubtedly became a must-see attraction for visitors to the capital. Yet for others, the elephant symbolized something else entirely. In a nation on the brink of economic panic and civil war, the president hosting such an absurdly impractical and expensive animal seemed like a profound misplacement of priorities. Critics could easily argue that the resources spent to feed and house this exotic beast were a frivolous waste, a tone-deaf display when so many Americans were struggling. The elephant, in its silent, imposing way, became an unwitting symbol of the disconnect between the political elite and the everyday concerns of the people. Its eventual departure was as quiet as its arrival, a diplomatic oddity that faded into the background as the nation marched inexorably toward its greatest crisis, leaving behind the brief, strange memory of a time when an elephant once walked the lawns of a divided White House. Now, from the overwhelming shadow of civil war and the strange spectacle of a presidential elephant, we find a moment of pure, tender humanity in the White House of Abraham Lincoln. While President Lincoln carried the unimaginable weight of a nation tearing itself apart, his home life, particularly with his youngest son Tad, offered pockets of profound normalcy and love. And it's in this context that we encounter a story so heartfelt it helped spark a beloved national tradition. The year was 1863, and the White House, like many homes across the Union, was preparing for Christmas. A festive turkey had been selected and delivered, destined for the holiday table, but this bird, whom Tad Lincoln named Jack, was about to have his fate changed by the compassion of a young boy and the soft heart of his father. Tad, who had a speech impediment and a boundless, energetic curiosity, quickly formed a strong attachment to the turkey. He didn't see a future meal, he saw a friend. He would play with Jack in the White House corridors, treating the bird more like a loyal dog than livestock. As the holiday drew nearer, Tad became increasingly distressed at the thought of his feathered companion meeting such an untimely end. He rushed to his father, the most powerful man in a country at war, and pleaded for the turkey's life. He argued passionately for a pardon, his concern for his friend cutting through the immense gravity of the presidential duties that surrounded them. President Lincoln, known for his deep empathy and his particular soft spot for his children, couldn't refuse his son's earnest request. In the midst of directing war strategy and drafting the Emancipation Proclamation, he took a moment to address a matter of true importance to a little boy. He issued a formal reprieve, an official presidential pardon for the turkey named Jack. The order was written with a touch of Lincoln's characteristic wit and legal precision, effectively sparing the bird from the dinner table and securing its place as a permanent resident of the White House grounds. This simple act of paternal kindness provided a much-needed moment of levity and domestic normalcy for a family that had already suffered immense personal loss and was living under the constant strain of war. While this particular event wasn't the start of an annual ceremony right away, the story of Tad Lincoln and his turkey became a cherished piece of White House lore. It perfectly encapsulated the humanity of a president often portrayed as a monumental, marble figure, reminding us that even in the darkest of times, there is room for mercy and for the simple, loving requests of a child. The anecdote was retold for decades, planting the seed for what would eventually become the modern White House turkey pardon, a light-hearted tradition that continues to this day, all thanks to a boy's friendship with a bird and a president's love for his son. While the Lincolns found solace in a spared turkey, another president, Andrew Johnson, sought a far more discreet and peculiar companionship amidst arguably even greater political strife. Following the assassination of Abraham Lincoln, Johnson inherited a nation still raw from war and bitterly divided over Reconstruction. His presidency was a constant battle with a hostile Congress, leading to his eventual impeachment, a first in American history. It was against this backdrop of overwhelming pressure and public scorn that Johnson formed one of the most understated and unexpected bonds with any White House animal, a colony of common white mice that had taken up residence in his bedroom. After long, grueling days filled with political confrontations and the immense task of trying to reunite a shattered country, the president would retreat to the relative quiet of his private quarters. It was there he discovered the tiny inhabitants drawn by the warmth and the crumbs of his solitary meals. Instead of calling for an exterminator or setting traps, Johnson did something remarkably gentle. He began to deliberately save bits of his own food, crusts of bread, morsels of cheese, and would personally feed these little creatures by hand. He took genuine delight in watching them scurry out from the woodwork, accepting his offerings without fear. For a man often portrayed as stubborn and combative, this was a hidden side, a moment of quiet tenderness and patience that stood in stark contrast to his public persona. This unusual relationship speaks volumes about Johnson's isolation and his need for a simple, unconditional connection. He was a president deeply unpopular with much of the political establishment and the public. These mice asked for nothing more than the food he provided. They were a living paradox, a powerful world leader, the most watched man in America, finding his only unquestioning loyalty in a group of wild rodents that society typically views as pests. There was no political posturing with them, no need to argue or defend his policies. Their presence offered a form of silent therapy, a tiny, living distraction from the enormous weight of his office. The image is both poignant and slightly surreal. One can picture the weary president surrounded by the immense portraits and fine furnishings of the executive residence, sitting quietly and extending a hand to a tiny, trusting mouse. It was a secret ritual, a small act of kindness that humanizes a figure often lost to the darker pages of history books. In choosing to care for these creatures, Andrew Johnson wasn't just feeding mice. He was nurturing a small pocket of peace in a life otherwise defined by relentless conflict, proving that even in the highest office, sometimes the smallest friends can make the biggest difference. From the quiet, secretive companionship of Andrew Johnson's mice, we moved to a pet that arrived with considerably more fanfare and left a lasting legacy on American culture far beyond the White House gates. Our seventh entry brings us to the administration of Rutherford B. Hayes and a graceful, vocal, and exotic gift that would capture the nation's imagination, the first Siamese cat to ever set paw on American soil. This wasn't just a personal pet, it was a living piece of diplomacy and a trendsetter that would forever change the landscape of American pet ownership. The story begins with David B. Sickles, a U.S. diplomat stationed in Bangkok in 1878. Seeking a unique and prestigious gift for the First Lady, Lucy Hayes, Sickles went beyond the usual trinkets and souvenirs. He acquired a sleek, striking feline from the royal stock of Siam, a breed revered in its homeland and utterly unknown in the United States. The cat, named Siam, was carefully transported on a long and undoubtedly stressful journey across the ocean, finally arriving at the White House in 1879 along with a formal note from Sickles himself. That note, which survives in the Hayes Presidential Library, explicitly stated that the cat was a gift for Mrs. Hayes from the consul, making her the official and delighted recipient of this extraordinary animal. The arrival of Siam caused an immediate sensation. Americans had simply never seen a cat like this before, with its creamy beige coat striking dark brown points on its ears, face, paws, and tail, and its mesmerizing blue almond-shaped eyes. The cat looked like something from a fairy tale. But it was Siam's personality that truly enchanted the Hayes family and their guests. Siamese cats are famously vocal, known for their loud, low-pitched meow that sounds more like a human baby's cry than a typical cat's meow. This talkative nature, combined with an intelligent, dog-like loyalty and a propensity for following its favorite humans from room to room, made Siam a constant and entertaining presence in the executive mansion. First Lady Lucy Hayes, known affectionately as Lemonade Lucy for her teetotaling ways, was utterly charmed by her new companion. Siam became a beloved member of the family, featured in newspaper reports and captivating everyone who visited. The cat's impact, however, stretched far beyond the White House lawn. Because the Hayes family was so prominent, their unusual pet became a national obsession. Newspapers across the country published stories describing the exotic Siamese cat from the White House, complete with illustrations trying to capture its unique appearance. For a nation fascinated by the exoticism of the Orient and the expanding reach of American diplomacy, Siam was a tangible symbol of that global connection. Almost overnight, a demand was created. Wealthy socialites and cat fanciers eager to emulate the first family began seeking out their own Siamese imports. The breed's popularity skyrocketed, transforming it from an obscure foreign curiosity into one of the most sought-after and recognizable cat breeds in America. The simple act of a diplomat's gift, amplified by the platform of the presidency, effectively introduced an entire breed to a new continent, shaping pet trends for generations to come. Siam the cat was more than a pet. It was a pioneer, a four-legged diplomat whose presence in the White House forged a new and enduring link between American homes and a distant kingdom. After the exotic elegance of the Siamese cat, the White House grounds welcomed a creature that was decidedly more rustic. Benjamin Harrison, the grandson of the Billy Goat president, brought his own menagerie to Washington, but none were quite as peculiar or as politically named as his pair of pet opossums, Mr. Reciprocity and Mr. Protection. These weren't just random names plucked from the air. They were direct references to the two hottest, most contentious economic debates of the 1890s, making these slow-moving marsupials walking, hissing political statements. The concept of protection referred to high protective tariffs, taxes placed on imported goods to make them more expensive and therefore protect American industries from foreign competition. This was a cornerstone of Republican policy at the time, fiercely defended by business interests in the North. Reciprocity, on the other hand, was a slightly more nuanced idea, suggesting that the United States could negotiate mutually beneficial trade agreements with other nations, lowering tariffs for partners who did the same for American goods. Harrison, caught between protectionist loyalists within his own party and a growing call for more open trade, tried to champion both ideas simultaneously. By naming his pets after these two conflicting policies, he created a living, breathing, and often bickering metaphor for the central economic dilemma of his presidency, right there on the South Lawn. The opossums themselves were a constant source of amusement and mild chaos. Unlike the dignified Siamese cat, these were wild animals at heart, notoriously skittish and known for their primary defense mechanism, playing dead. One can only imagine the panic of a new White House staffer encountering one of the president's prized pets lying completely limp and unresponsive on the path, only to have it miraculously spring back to life and waddle away moments later. They were notorious for their escape attempts, their clever paws finding weaknesses in their enclosures, leading to frantic searches through the shrubbery. The Harrison grandchildren were reportedly delighted by their antics, seeing them as fascinating, odd-looking playthings, while adults likely viewed them with a mixture of bemusement and exasperation. This choice of pet says a great deal about Benjamin Harrison's character and his political strategy. While other presidents received exotic animals as diplomatic gifts, Harrison and his family actively chose to keep native North American opossums. It was a deliberate embrace of an authentically American, albeit misunderstood, animal, reinforcing an image of folksy simplicity and connection to the land. Furthermore, by giving them such pointed names, Harrison demonstrated a witty, almost academic approach to his politics, turning a policy debate into a domestic conversation starter. Guests at White House functions wouldn't just see strange pets, they'd be prompted to discuss the very issues that defined the era. Mr. Reciprocity and Mr. Protection were more than pets, they were a unique form of political theater, a quirky and unforgettable reminder that the debates that rage in the halls of Congress have a funny way of finding a home in the most unexpected places. If you thought Benjamin Harrison's political opossums were a handful, wait until you hear about the creature that prowled the grounds during Theodore Roosevelt's administration, a spotted hyena that answered to the name Bill. This wasn't some eccentric purchase, it was a formal diplomatic gift, a living representation of America's growing global reach. The Emperor of Ethiopia, Menelik II, sent the young hyena to President Roosevelt as a gesture of goodwill and respect. It was an offering fit for a man already known for his love of the wild, his passion for big game hunting, and his burgeoning reputation as a conservationist. The hyena arrived in Washington and was promptly added to what can only be described as the most chaotic and spectacular private zoo ever assembled at 160 Pennsylvania Avenue. The Roosevelt White House was a veritable ark of bizarre and wonderful creatures. Alongside the hyena, the family cared for a small bear named Jonathan Edwards, a badger named Josiah, a blue macaw, a pony, a one-legged rooster, a barn owl, a pig named Maud, and a veritable snake pit of garter snakes. And that's not even counting the more traditional pets like dogs and cats. The children treated the South Lawn as their personal safari park, leading their unusual companions on leashes or simply watching them interact in a state of controlled, glorious chaos. The hyena, with its powerful jaws and unnerving, laughing vocalization, was the undisputed king of this strange kingdom. Housing a fully grown hyena, however, presented a unique set of challenges that went far beyond those of a standard pet. While Bill was reportedly somewhat tame upon arrival, a hyena is a powerful predator with instincts that cannot be domesticated. Its bite is one of the strongest in the animal kingdom, capable of crushing bone. Its distinctive whooping laugh, especially at night, must have been a terrifying sound echoing from the White House grounds, likely causing more than a few nearby residents to question their sanity. Feeding Bill was another monumental task. As a scavenger and hunter, its diet required vast quantities of raw meat, a logistical and financial undertaking that fell to the White House staff, who now had to source and handle carcasses fit for a wild predator. The enclosure had to be immensely strong and secure, not just to keep the hyena in, but to keep curious onlookers and the Roosevelt children out. There's a famous, likely apocryphal, story that the president once attempted to have the hyena pull a cart like a horse, an endeavor that would have undoubtedly ended in spectacular, disastrous failure, perfectly illustrating the blend of bold curiosity and sheer audacity that defined the Roosevelt era. Bill the hyena was more than just a strange pet. It was a perfect symbol of Theodore Roosevelt himself. The creature was powerful, unconventional, somewhat frightening to those who didn't understand it, and utterly captivating. Its presence spoke to Roosevelt's lifelong fascination with the natural world in all its raw, untamed glory. He didn't want a curated, safe collection of animals. He wanted the real, unfiltered thing, even if it meant his home was filled with the sounds and smells of the wilderness. The hyena represented a world beyond America's borders, a gift from an African emperor that sat comfortably alongside Native American animals, reflecting Roosevelt's vision of the United States as a rising power on the global stage, unafraid of engaging with the exotic and the powerful. In the end, like many of the more dangerous Roosevelt pets, Bill's stay was temporary. The practicalities of keeping such an animal eventually won out, and it was donated to the National Zoo, where it could be cared for properly and viewed by a fascinated public. But for a brief, unforgettable time, the laugh of a hyena was part of the official soundtrack of the White House, a bizarre and thrilling reminder of the unique character of the man and the family who lived there. While the formidable hyena Bill represented the grand scale of Roosevelt's adventurous spirit, another, much smaller creature captured the personal and surprisingly sentimental side of the Rough Rider president, a badger named Josiah. This particular pet's origin story is one of the most charming in all of presidential history, born not from diplomatic pomp but from a spontaneous act of admiration from a child. During a whistle-stop campaign tour in 1900, Roosevelt's train made a brief halt in a small Kansas town. Amid the crowd of cheering adults, a young girl stepped forward, presenting the candidate with a shoe box. Inside was not a campaign button or a letter of support, but a live and likely very nervous baby badger. The girl explained that the animal had been orphaned, and she believed that the famous hunter and outdoorsman Theodore Roosevelt was the one person in the country who would know how to care for it properly. This was more than just a gift. It was a testament to the powerful public image Roosevelt had cultivated. He was seen not just as a politician, but as a genuine man of the wilderness, a figure who understood the natural world on an intimate level. He couldn't refuse such a heartfelt offering. He accepted the shoebox named the badger Josiah, and the tiny, cantankerous creature officially joined the already overflowing Roosevelt menagerie. Josiah quickly became a favorite of the Roosevelt children, particularly the irrepressible Quentin. While the badger was certainly not a cuddly pet in the traditional sense, it possessed a fierce, grumpy charisma that the family found endlessly entertaining. It had a particular habit of nipping at the ankles of anyone it deemed suspicious, which, given its naturally suspicious disposition, was almost everyone except the immediate family. This led to a series of comical and likely painful encounters with startled White House staff and unsuspecting visitors. More than once, a dignified senator or a foreign ambassador had to make a hastily executed retreat from a determined, low-slung badger on the warpath. Yet, beyond the comedy, Josiah's presence was deeply symbolic. While Roosevelt is rightly celebrated for his massive conservation achievements protecting hundreds of millions of acres of public land and establishing the National Park Service, his care for a single, unglamorous, and often maligned animal like a badger speaks to a more profound ecological understanding. Conservation wasn't just about saving majestic landscapes for Roosevelt. It was about a respect for every creature, great and small, and recognizing its place in the natural order. The badger, a creature of the soil, a digger and a survivor, was as worthy of care and attention as any grizzly bear or soaring eagle. In welcoming Josiah into his home, Roosevelt was living the principle that true conservation begins with a personal connection to and responsibility for the natural world, no matter how small or prickly its representative might be. The badger from Kansas was a living, breathing reminder that the wild heart of America wasn't just in its vast western parks, but could be found in a shoebox offered with hope by the next generation. Following the wild, untamed energy of the Roosevelt menagerie, the White House grounds took on a much more pastoral and perhaps more fragrant atmosphere with the next resident. In an era before reliable, nationwide refrigeration, the most practical way for a president to ensure his family had a steady supply of fresh, uncontaminated milk was to keep the source on site. For William Howard Taft, a man with a well-documented appreciation for good food and a physically imposing presence to match, this wasn't just a matter of convenience, it was a necessity. And so, the last presidential cow to ever graze on the White House lawn arrived, a handsome Holstein named Pauline Wayne. Pauline was not the Taft family's first cow, she was actually a replacement. The president's previous cow, a Jersey named Mooly Wooly, had proven to be a less-than-ideal producer. Seeking a more reliable source, Taft reached out to a Wisconsin senator, the aptly named Isaac Stephenson, who happened to be a prominent dairy farmer. Senator Stephenson was delighted to assist, selecting his very best Holstein from his prize-winning herd and shipping her all the way to Washington, D.C. Pauline Wayne, named after the senator's hometown of Stephenson, Michigan, which was located in Wayne County, was an immediate upgrade. She was a magnificent animal, a black and white beauty who quickly settled into her prestigious new home, providing the Tafts with a staggering 8 gallons of rich, creamy milk every single day. But Pauline was far more than just a walking milk factory. She became a genuine Washington celebrity and a beloved public figure. In an age of increasing industrialization, her presence on the White House lawn was a comforting, anachronistic sight, a living link to the nation's agrarian past right in the heart of its modernizing capital. She was a popular subject for postcards and newspaper photographs, often pictured contentedly grazing with the White House as her backdrop. The public adored her, and she was known for her gentle, placid demeanor. Unlike the mischievous opossums or the dangerous hyena, Pauline Wayne was the picture of serene, productive dignity. Her daily routine was a public spectacle. She would be led from her stable to her favorite grazing spot by her handler, often pausing to greet visitors who came specifically to see the famous first cow. For many Americans, she was a symbol of wholesome, simple values, a refreshing contrast to the complex political machinations happening inside the building behind her. Her tenure, however, marked the end of an era. As technology advanced, with pasteurization becoming more widespread and home refrigeration becoming more common, the practical need for a presidential cow dwindled. Pauline Wayne was the last of her kind. When the Tafts left the White House in 1913, Pauline was returned to Senator Stephenson's farm in Wisconsin, living out her days in peaceful retirement. Her departure signaled a quiet but significant shift. The White House would never again be a working farm, however small. The connection between the president's table and the land it came from became more abstract, mediated by supply chains and industries. Pauline Wayne, the elegant Holstein, was the final, beloved representative of a time when the executive mansion wasn't just a symbol of power, but also, in its own small way, a home that provided for itself. As the United States entered the First World War, President Woodrow Wilson faced a nation mobilizing for an unprecedented conflict, and the White House itself was expected to lead by example in matters of economy and patriotism. Amidst food rationing, fuel conservation drives, and the sale of Liberty bonds, the president introduced a solution to one particular household expense that was both brilliantly practical and wonderfully symbolic: a flock of sheep. The expansive lawns of the White House required a small army of groundskeepers to maintain, and with so many young men, including the estate's gardeners, being called up to serve, Wilson saw an opportunity. Why not employ a natural, self-sufficient mowing crew? He acquired a flock of 18 pedigreed sheep, primarily of the rare and valuable Shropshire breed, and set them to work grazing the south lawn. This was far more than a simple cost-cutting measure. It was a powerful piece of political theater. The image of these gentle animals quietly cropping the grass where soldiers had once paraded sent a clear message to the American public. Every citizen, from the president down, was making sacrifices and finding ingenious ways to contribute to the war effort. The sheep became instant celebrities, their daily routine a public attraction that drew crowds of admiring Washingtonians. They were not just lawnmowers, they were furry, four-legged patriots. Their presence transformed the White House grounds from a perfectly manicured showpiece into a functional, productive space, a working farm reflecting the nation's shift to a wartime economy. The flock even expanded during its tenure, with several lambs being born on the property, a heartening symbol of hope and renewal during a time of great darkness and loss. But President Wilson and his resourceful wife, Edith, saw another layer of potential in their woolly workforce. When shearing time came, the wool from the entire flock was carefully collected. This was no small amount. In 1 year alone, the fleeces weighed in at over 100 pounds. Rather than keep it, the Wilsons auctioned it off for the benefit of the American Red Cross. The auctions became major public events, with the wool being divided into lots and sold to wool merchants and patriotic citizens eager to own a piece of history. The auctions raised a significant sum, thousands of dollars that went directly toward supporting the vital work of nurses and relief workers on the front lines. People weren't just buying wool, they were buying into an idea, purchasing a tangible connection to a collective national endeavor. Even the gold medals won by the sheep at the International Livestock Show were sold for the cause. In this simple, elegant system, the White House sheep managed to save money on landscaping, provide fertilizer for the vegetable gardens that had replaced flower beds, and generate crucial funds for humanitarian aid, all while serving as a constant, bleating reminder of the creativity and commitment required to win a modern war. While the Wilson sheep were a marvel of wartime practicality, the next administration brought a pet that was all about pure, unadulterated fun. In the early 1920s, America was ready to shake off the somber mood of the Great War and embrace a new era of modernity and leisure. The presidency of Warren G. Harding, often remembered for its political scandals, was also marked by a sense of casual sociability, and no creature embodied this playful spirit better than the first family's pet raccoon, Rebecca. Her origin story, however, begins not with an intention to adopt a wild animal, but with a far more grim purpose. In the autumn of 1923, a supporter from Mississippi sent a live raccoon to the White House, fully intending for it to be the main course for the Harding family's Thanksgiving feast. This was not an entirely unusual practice at the time. as raccoon was still considered a traditional food in many parts of the rural South. But when the crate arrived, the Harding family took one look at the curious, intelligent animal inside with its bandit masked face and dexterous little hands, and they simply couldn't bring themselves to follow through with the original plan. First Lady Florence Harding, in particular, was utterly charmed. She named the raccoon Rebecca and immediately welcomed her into the family as a beloved pet, not a future meal. It was a spontaneous act of compassion that turned a potential tragedy into one of the most memorable and endearing pet stories in White House history. Rebecca was not merely kept in a cage, she was given the full run of the White House grounds and was treated as a true member of the household. She quickly became a local celebrity, known for her mischievous antics and her remarkable intelligence. The Hardings even had a specially crafted leash made for her, and she was frequently taken for walks on the South Lawn, a sight that never failed to delight photographers and visiting dignitaries alike. But Rebecca's fame reached its peak when she was given a role in the annual White House Easter egg roll. The president himself fashioned a custom harness and lead from the presidential blue colors, and Rebecca was presented as an honored, if unconventional, guest of honor at the event. Children and parents alike were utterly fascinated by this well-dressed, leashed raccoon mingling among them, a moment of pure, whimsical magic that perfectly captured the light-hearted mood the Hardings wanted to project. Life with a raccoon, however, was not without its challenges. Rebecca was a creature of immense curiosity and boundless energy, her clever paws capable of opening latches, unscrewing jars, and investigating every corner of the executive mansion. She was particularly fond of playing in the fountains on the grounds, and she had a noted fascination with the shiny objects in the First Lady's quarters. One can only imagine the gentle chaos of a state dinner being punctuated by the sound of a raccoon rustling the drapes in the next room or the frantic searches whenever she managed one of her many clever escapes. Yet the Hardings adored her all the more for these quirks. She was a constant source of entertainment and affection, a living symbol of their informal, almost boisterous approach to White House life. In a presidency that would later be overshadowed by the Teapot Dome scandal, Rebecca the raccoon remains a bright spot, a reminder of the genuine joy and unexpected turns that can define life at the highest levels of power. The tradition of unconventional White House companions didn't end with the Harding administration. In fact, it reached its absolute zenith with President Calvin Coolidge, a man whose quiet, reserved public persona stood in hilarious contrast to the absolute circus of exotic animals he and First Lady Grace collected. If the Roosevelt White House was a zoo, the Coolidge White House was a full-blown menagerie of the bizarre and wonderful, a collection so diverse it would make a modern wildlife sanctuary blush. And leading this furry, feathered, and scaly parade was another raccoon, continuing the trend but with a personality and backstory all her own. This particular raccoon arrived not as a potential meal but as a gift meant for the Thanksgiving table in a different sense. She was sent to the White House in 1926 by a Mississippi supporter who assumed the president would enjoy a traditional raccoon dinner. But much like the Hardings before them, the Coolidges took one look at the intelligent, bright-eyed creature and immediately decided she was far too charming to eat. They named her Rebecca, a wonderful historical coincidence that gives us two presidential raccoons with the same name just a few years apart. But this Rebecca's destiny was far more glamorous than simply being walked on a leash. The Coolidges didn't just keep her as a pet, they fully integrated her into their public life in the most extraordinary way. For the 1927 White House Easter egg roll, President Coolidge had a custom rhinestone-studded collar crafted for Rebecca. Then, in a moment of pure surreal brilliance, he attached a thin, elegant lead to that collar and proceeded to walk the raccoon around the South Lawn, introducing her to astonished children and dignitaries as if she were a prized show poodle. The image of the famously silent and stern Silent Cal casually parading a wild raccoon on a jeweled leash remains one of the most delightfully bizarre and humanizing moments in presidential history. But Rebecca was merely the flagship creature in an entire arc of strange and wonderful animals. The Coolidge collection was a testament to their genuine love for creatures of all kinds, many of which were gifts from admirers and foreign dignitaries who quickly learned of the first family's unique soft spot. From the swamps of Africa came a pygmy hippopotamus named Billy, a gift from the Firestone Company's Harvey Firestone. While Billy was too large to actually live at the White House and was quickly donated to the National Zoo, his arrival as a presidential pet was a sensation, a miniature version of a creature most Americans had only seen in drawings. From the Australian outback came a wallaby, a gift that frequently hopped around the grounds, astonishing visitors with its powerful legs and pouched offspring. The list spirals into the fantastical from there. A family of mongoose, a pair of lion cubs named Tax Reduction and Budget Bureau, a Pekingese dog, a donkey, a bobcat, and even a duet of raccoons after Rebecca proved so delightful. Perhaps the most daring addition was a black bear named Smokey, a gift from the state of Mississippi. Smokey was initially kept in a cage on the White House grounds, but the Coolidge children so adored him that the president, in a moment of questionable judgment, allowed the bear to be walked around the lawn on a chain. These walks became a spectator sport for White House reporters, who would watch with a mixture of terror and amusement as the young bear, not yet fully grown but already immensely powerful, would playfully tug his handlers toward the prized White House gardens. The situation culminated in what can only be described as a predictable disaster when Smokey managed to break his chain one afternoon and went on a joyful rampage through the carefully tended flora, destroying several expensive bushes and small trees before he was finally seduced back to his enclosure with a bucket of sweets. It was an incident that perfectly encapsulated the Coolidge menagerie, well-intentioned, utterly unique, and teetering on the edge of glorious, chaotic disaster at all times. This astounding collection was more than just an eccentric hobby. It was a reflection of the nation's mood during the Roaring Twenties. America was confident, prosperous, and looking outward, fascinated by the exotic and the new. The Coolidge's menagerie was a physical manifestation of that global curiosity, bringing the wonders of the world directly to the people's front lawn. Furthermore, in an age before television and widespread travel, these animals served as a powerful public relations tool. Newspapers covered the arrivals and antics of each new creature with breathless excitement, and thousands of citizens would line the White House fence hoping for a glimpse of the wallaby or the bear. President Coolidge, often perceived as cold and remote, used these animals to show a softer, more paternal side. He was frequently photographed with them, a small smile playing on his lips as a raccoon climbed his leg or a bear cub nuzzled his hand. In surrounding himself with this bizarre collection, Silent Cal found a voice that resonated with the public, a voice of quiet wonder, unexpected humor, and a deep, abiding affection for the natural world in all its strange and beautiful forms. His administration remains, without a doubt, the most zoologically diverse in American history, a golden age of weirdness that may never be matched. Among the many astonishing creatures that called the Coolidge White House home, perhaps none was more emblematic of the era's bold, globe-trotting curiosity than Billy, the pygmy hippopotamus. This was not a pet found wandering the fields of Virginia or gifted by a local farmer. Billy was a direct product of America's growing industrial and diplomatic reach into previously unexplored corners of the world. He was a present from the famed tire magnate Harvey Firestone, who had acquired the young animal during one of his company's expeditions to Liberia in West Africa. The gift was a perfect symbol of the times, a powerful American industrialist operating on a global scale, presenting the nation's leader with a living, breathing piece of exotic wilderness. For a president who already kept a raccoon on a jeweled leash and walked a bear on the South Lawn, a miniature hippo must have seemed like a perfectly logical next addition. The arrival of Billy at the White House caused an absolute media frenzy. The American public was utterly captivated by the idea of this exotic, prehistoric-looking creature taking up residence at their most famous address. Pygmy hippos were almost mythical to most people. Smaller and more reclusive than their common river hippo cousins, they were rare even in their native habitats. Newspapers across the country carried stories and artists' renditions of the strange new resident, trying to capture the spectacle of a creature that looked like it had wandered out of a storybook and into the executive mansion. For a brief, glorious period, the leader of the free world was also the caretaker of a baby hippopotamus, a fact that perfectly captured the surreal and optimistic spirit of the 1920s. The practical realities of caring for Billy, however, quickly became apparent. While pygmy implies a small size, these animals are still formidable, weighing between 400 and 600 pounds as adults. Their needs are incredibly specialized and far beyond the capacity of the White House ground staff. A hippo, even a small one, requires constant access to water for swimming and submersion to keep its sensitive skin moist and regulated. The idea of constructing a sufficiently large and heated pool on the South Lawn was a logistical and financial non-starter. Furthermore, their diet is immense. A growing pygmy hippo can consume dozens of pounds of vegetation, fruits, and specially formulated grains every single day. The cost and effort of sourcing this food alone would have been a massive, ongoing undertaking. The Coolidges, for all their love of unusual pets, were also practical people. They recognized almost immediately that while Billy was a wonderful diplomatic gesture, he simply could not receive the proper care he needed in a residential setting, even one as expansive as the White House. His well-being had to come first. With characteristic grace and a keen sense of public relations, President Coolidge made the only responsible decision. After a very short stay, just long enough for the public to enjoy the novelty, Billy was formally donated to the Smithsonian's National Zoological Park in Washington, D.C. This was not seen as a rejection of the gift, but rather a thoughtful act of conservation. The move allowed Billy to live in a habitat specifically designed for his needs, with expert veterinarians and caretakers on staff. It also transformed him from a private presidential oddity into a national treasure, a beloved public exhibit that millions of ordinary Americans could come and visit for themselves. Billy thrived at the National Zoo, becoming one of its most popular attractions for decades and even siring offspring, helping to raise awareness and scientific understanding of his threatened species. In this way, the story of Calvin Coolidge's pygmy hippo has a truly happy ending. What began as a symbol of corporate prestige and exoticism evolved into a lasting contribution to public education and wildlife conservation, a unique legacy for one of the weirdest and most wonderful pets to ever briefly grace the White House. While the Coolidge's menagerie represented a joyful embrace of the exotic, the next bizarre resident arrived at a White House shrouded in the deepening gloom of the Great Depression. Herbert Hoover, a brilliant engineer and organizer, found his presidency defined by an economic catastrophe he seemed powerless to stop. Public perception painted him as cold, aloof, and out of touch with the suffering of everyday Americans, a man more comfortable with cold statistics than warm compassion. It is against this stark backdrop that the story of his brief tenure with a pet alligator becomes so fascinatingly incongruous. This wasn't a formal diplomatic gift or a carefully chosen family pet. The creature literally showed up on the doorstep, an unexpected and rather alarming house guest. The alligator's origin is as peculiar as its presence. It was sent to the White House not by a foreign dignitary, but by a well-meaning, though perhaps misguided, supporter from the state of Louisiana. The intention was likely to cheer up the president or his family with a unique piece of American wildlife during a profoundly difficult time. Imagine the scene when the crate was opened on the White House grounds, revealing not a basket of fruit or a letter of support, but a young, live alligator, a creature more at home in the steamy bayous of the South than the formal gardens of the executive mansion. For a man known for his rigid order and disciplined approach, this was the ultimate curveball, a piece of untamed chaos delivered right to his door. Hoover's reaction was surprisingly accommodating. Rather than immediately shipping the creature off to the nearest zoo, he allowed it to stay. The alligator was given a temporary home in a specially designated bathroom, or perhaps a water-filled tub somewhere on the grounds, much like John Quincy Adams's reptilian resident a century earlier. For a short time, this dangerous, prehistoric-looking predator became an unofficial part of the Hoover White House. The president's two sons, Alan and Herbert Jr., were reportedly thrilled by the exotic new addition, a bright spot of excitement in a home otherwise filled with the grim weight of presidential duty and national despair. The alligator's presence offered a strange, almost surreal form of distraction, a talking point that had nothing to do with bank failures or bread lines. The contrast between the president's public image and his scaly housemate could not have been more pronounced. Here was Herbert Hoover, the stern, methodical Quaker, sharing his home with one of nature's most efficient and fearsome carnivores. The alligator, with its cold-blooded instinct and primal demeanor, was the absolute antithesis of Hoover's own carefully controlled and rational personality. It was a living symbol of the unpredictable, uncontrollable forces that had ravaged the nation's economy, a problem that could not be solved by engineering flowcharts or committee meetings. The creature simply existed, a silent, powerful reminder of a world that operated on rules far beyond human design or understanding. Ultimately, the practicality of housing a growing alligator prevailed. Unlike the more whimsical Coolidges, Hoover was not a natural collector of exotic fauna. The novelty wore off quickly against the backdrop of immense presidential responsibilities and the very real logistical nightmare of keeping a dangerous animal. The alligator's stay was brief, and it was soon relocated to a more suitable permanent home, likely a park or zoo. This strange interlude, often overlooked in the grand narrative of Hoover's troubled presidency, provides a rare and deeply humanizing glimpse into the man. It reveals a capacity for whimsy, or at least paternal indulgence, that his public persona completely obscured. In the end, the alligator was a fleeting anomaly, a bizarre and bewildering moment where the raw, untamed wilderness of America briefly paddled in a White House bathtub, offering a momentary escape from the overwhelming crisis just beyond the gates. While the Hoover administration grappled with an alligator and an economic crisis, the next resident of the White House brought a chill from the most remote and frozen place on Earth. Our journey now takes us to the presidency of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and a creature so utterly out of place it seems like a visitor from another planet, an emperor penguin. This was no ordinary gift. It was a living trophy from the very edge of human exploration, presented to the president by one of the 20th century's greatest adventurers, Rear Admiral Richard E. Bayard was a national hero, a figure whose daring expeditions to the Arctic and Antarctic captivated the American public's imagination. His first Antarctic expedition in 1928 to 1930 had been a monumental success, establishing the base camp known as Little America and making the first flight over the South Pole. When he returned to the United States, he was greeted with parades and adulation, a symbol of American courage and scientific curiosity. It was during this triumphant tour that he visited the White House and presented President Roosevelt with a living, breathing emperor penguin, a juvenile likely collected from the icy rookeries near Little America. The gift was profoundly symbolic. It represented the pinnacle of exploration, a creature from a land so harsh and inaccessible that it might as well have been the moon. For FDR, a man with a deep and lifelong passion for the sea and naval history, the penguin was a tangible connection to those final frontiers, a piece of the great unknown delivered right to his door. The public reaction to the penguin's arrival was a mixture of sheer delight and utter bewilderment. emperor penguins were virtually unknown in America outside of scientific circles and grainy newsreel footage from Bayard's expeditions. To see one in person or even in photographs was to witness a creature of almost mythical proportions. It stood nearly 3 feet tall, even as a juvenile, with a sleek black and white plumage that looked like a formal suit and a dignified, curiously human-like demeanor. Newspapers ran stories marveling at this strange Antarctic ambassador, and it quickly became a beloved celebrity, a welcome distraction from the grim economic realities of the Great Depression that defined FDR's first term. However, the practicalities of caring for an animal evolved for the harshest climate on Earth quickly became a monumental challenge for the White House staff. The emperor penguin's natural habitat is one of sub-zero temperatures, blizzard winds, and endless ice. Recreating even a fraction of that environment in humid, swampy Washington, D.C. was an engineering nightmare. The penguin required a specialized enclosure that was kept consistently cold, likely with large blocks of ice delivered daily and perhaps even early refrigeration units. Its diet was another immense hurdle. In the wild, emperor penguins subsist on a diet of fish, squid, and krill, consuming vast quantities to maintain their energy in the freezing water. Sourcing fresh, high-quality seafood in the quantities needed and ensuring it was safe for the bird to eat became a daily logistical operation for the household staff, who now had to become instant experts in polar avian nutrition. Despite the best efforts of everyone involved, it soon became apparent that the penguin was not thriving. The climate was all wrong, and the confines of its enclosure, no matter how well-intentioned, could not compare to the vast, open ice shelves of its home. Recognizing that the animal's welfare was paramount, President Roosevelt made the only responsible decision. The penguin's stay at the White House was brief, and it was soon relocated to a permanent home where it could receive expert care from professionals. It found a new residence at the Smithsonian's National Zoo, which was far better equipped to handle the unique needs of such an exotic species. There, it could live in a properly climate-controlled environment and become a source of wonder and education for the millions of Americans who visited the zoo, rather than a private curiosity for the presidential mansion. This episode, while short-lived, is a beautiful reflection of Franklin Roosevelt's own complex character. On one hand, it highlights his genuine fascination with exploration, science, and the natural world, a trait he shared with his cousin Theodore. He appreciated the penguin not just as a novelty, but as a symbol of human achievement and the vast, unexplored wonders of our planet. On the other hand, it demonstrates his inherent pragmatism and compassion. He didn't cling to the animal for its publicity value. He recognized its suffering and prioritized its well-being, ensuring it was placed in a setting where it could truly flourish. The emperor penguin was a fleeting but memorable guest, a waddling, tuxedoed reminder that even in the depths of national crisis, there was still room for wonder, for curiosity about the wider world, and for acts of kindness toward the most vulnerable of creatures, no matter how far from home they might be. While the Roosevelt penguin represented the far reaches of global exploration, the next White House resident found its way from a towering oak tree just outside the president's window. In the tense early years of the Cold War, President Harry S. Truman was a man who bore the unimaginable weight of the world on his shoulders. He had made the decision to use atomic weapons to end a world war, was now orchestrating the Berlin airlift to stare down Soviet aggression, and was laying the groundwork for the NATO alliance. His days were filled with grim intelligence briefings, high-stakes strategy sessions, and the constant looming anxiety of a potential new global conflict. It was against this backdrop of immense pressure that a tiny, unexpected visitor offered a daily moment of pure, unscripted peace. The story begins with a seemingly ordinary gray squirrel that had made its home in the ancient trees dotting the south lawn. This particular squirrel, however, was unusually bold and charismatic. It began appearing regularly on the windowsill of the Oval Office study, peering in with bright, curious eyes as the president worked at his desk. Instead of shooing the creature away, Truman was charmed by its audacity. He started leaving nuts out for it, and a unique ritual was born. Each day, the squirrel would arrive for its presidential handout, and Truman would take a brief respite from managing the fate of the free world to commune with this small, wild animal. He even gave it a name, Pete. What began as a simple act of feeding quickly blossomed into a genuine friendship. Pete the squirrel became a fixture of the Truman White House, granted unprecedented freedom to roam the grounds and even the outer rooms of the mansion itself. The president's staff and the Secret Service detail grew accustomed to the sight of the bushy-tailed rodent scurrying down hallways or perched on a piece of furniture. Truman didn't just tolerate Pete, he actively encouraged his presence, finding a genuine sense of calm and normalcy in their interactions. For a few minutes each day, the immense burdens of the presidency would momentarily lift, replaced by the simple, uncomplicated task of earning the trust of a wild creature. It was a form of therapy, a tiny pocket of wilderness and spontaneity in a life otherwise governed by protocol, secrecy, and unimaginable responsibility. This relationship, however, was not without its diplomatic complications. Pete's fearless nature and his understanding that the White House was his territory sometimes led to conflicts with the many international gifts that arrived on the grounds. Most notably, the President of France presented the Trumans with a pair of elegant, ornamental pheasants to be kept in a specially built aviary. For Pete, these large, unfamiliar birds were not honored guests, they were interlopers in his domain. In a series of brazen raids, the squirrel would ransack the pheasant's food supply, terrorizing the beautiful birds and creating a minor international incident played out in the shrubs and flower beds. The staff was eventually forced to construct a special, squirrel-proof lid for the aviary, a humorous but necessary solution to preserve both interspecies peace and Franco-American relations. The story of Pete the squirrel offers a profoundly humanizing window into the character of Harry Truman. Publicly, he was "Give 'em hell, Harry," a tough, decisive leader who never shied away from a difficult choice. But privately, he was a man who found solace in the simple rhythms of nature, a Midwestern farmer at heart who understood that some things, like the trust of a wild animal, could not be commanded or controlled, only earned with patience and kindness. Pete was a living reminder of the world beyond geopolitics, a world where the most pressing concern was the location of the next acorn. In befriending a squirrel, Truman wasn't just being sentimental. He was actively preserving a piece of his own humanity, ensuring that the man who held the codes to the atomic bomb never lost touch with the gentle, patient soul who could sit quietly and wait for a tiny friend to appear on the windowsill. While the quiet friendship between Harry Truman and a squirrel offered a gentle respite from the pressures of the Cold War, the next presidential pet brought a much more vocal and performative brand of levity to the executive mansion. The 1950s were a decade defined by immense, sobering responsibilities for President Dwight D. Eisenhower. He navigated the terrifying complexities of the nuclear age, managed the burgeoning space race, and oversaw the largest public works project in American history with the interstate highway system. It was an administration of grand, concrete, and often grim undertakings, and presiding over it all from a perch in the White House residence was a brilliant green parrot named Gabby, whose talent for mimicry provided a crucial and often hilarious counterpoint to the gravity of the era. Gabby was not originally a presidential parrot. He belonged to Eisenhower's mother-in-law, Elvira Dowd, and came to live at the White House with the first family. This personal connection made him an integral part of the household rather than a formal diplomatic gift or a public spectacle. The parrot quickly became a favorite of the president himself. Eisenhower, known to the public as the stern, five-star general, and Ike the golfing everyman, had a softer, more private side that was utterly charmed by this clever, talking bird. After a long day in the Oval Office, dealing with crises in Korea or debates over defense spending, the president could retreat to the family quarters and be greeted not by more weighty matters, but by the cheerful, nonsensical chatter of his feathered companion. Gabby's true talent, however, was his uncanny ability to mimic sounds he heard around him. He didn't just repeat words, he captured the exact tone, cadence, and personality behind them. His most famous party trick was a perfect imitation of the distinct, metallic grinding noise of the White House elevator. Guests would be mingling in the residence, only to hear what they thought was the elevator arriving, signaling the approach of the president or another important figure. They would stop their conversations and turn expectantly toward the door, only to be met with silence and then the realization that they had been fooled by a bird. This prank never seemed to get old, and it became a beloved running joke among the White House staff and frequent visitors, a moment of shared laughter that broke the formal tension of any gathering. But Gabby's repertoire extended far beyond mechanical sounds. He had a particular fondness for whistling the catchy tunes of popular big band numbers of the day, filling the rooms with cheerful music that had no visible source. More remarkably, he picked up and repeated snippets of conversation, especially Eisenhower's own distinctive phrases. The image of the commander-in-chief, a man who had planned the D-Day invasion, being echoed by a parrot squawking his own familiar expressions, is a wonderfully humanizing one. It suggests a home life filled with warmth and humor, a place where the immense pressures of the presidency could be momentarily dissolved by the absurdity of a bird repeating your own words back to you. The presence of Gabby the parrot during such a tense period in history is more significant than it might first appear. In an age where the fear of nuclear annihilation was a constant undercurrent in American life, the White House wasn't just a seat of power, it was also a home. Gabby represented the normal, joyful, and sometimes silly aspects of domesticity that persist even in the shadow of world-altering events. He was a living reminder that the president, for all his power, was also a man who enjoyed simple pleasures and the company of a pet that made him laugh. The laughter that Gabby provoked, the startled jumps at his fake elevator noise, the smiles at his whistled songs, these were tiny but vital acts of psychological maintenance. They provided Eisenhower and those around him with moments of genuine levity, a mental breather from the endless strategizing and the weight of a world holding its breath. In his own noisy, feathered way, the parrot wasn't just a pet. He was a key member of the support staff, his primary duty to lighten the mood and remind everyone that even in the most serious of times, there is always room for a little playful mischief. Yet even in the carefully curated world of Camelot, where every public moment was polished to a brilliant sheen, the private life of the Kennedy White House was delightfully unpredictable, thanks in no small part to its animal residents. The family had a genuine fondness for pets, welcoming everything from ponies and dogs to a canary and a cat, creating a lively, domestic atmosphere that charmed the nation. But among this beloved menagerie, one creature arrived as a seemingly innocent gift and promptly proceeded to outgrow every expectation, both literally and figuratively. The story begins not with a foreign dignitary, but with the towering, boisterous figure of Vice President Lyndon B. Johnson, a man known for his immense political power and his equally immense, often overwhelming personality. LBJ, a Texas rancher at heart, had a tendency to give gifts that reflected his own grand and unsubtle character. For young Caroline Kennedy's birthday, he decided against a conventional doll or a tea set. Instead, he presented her with a living, breathing rabbit. This wasn't just any rabbit, it was a substantial creature, and the vice president, with his famous flair for the dramatic, bestowed upon it the equally dramatic name of Zaza, after the glamorous and famously outspoken actress Zaza Gabor. The intention was pure Texas charm, a hearty, down-to-earth pet for the little girl who seemingly had everything. The image was wonderfully incongruous, the sophisticated first family, the epitome of East Coast elegance, now in possession of a rabbit named by a force of nature from the pedernales. Initially, Zaza seemed like a perfect addition. Caroline was delighted with her new furry friend, and for a short while, the rabbit was a cute and manageable companion, hopping about in its enclosure on the White House grounds. But then, something remarkable began to happen. Zaza started to grow, and she didn't just grow a little. She underwent a transformation of truly colossal proportions. This was no ordinary bunny. It was almost certainly a Flemish giant, a breed known for its massive size, often reaching upwards of 20 pounds or more. The adorable pet was rapidly turning into a behemoth, a gentle giant with an equally giant appetite for anything and everything she could find. The White House gardens, meticulously maintained by a dedicated staff, became her personal salad bar. Prized flowers, carefully cultivated shrubs, and decorative vegetables all fell victim to Zaza's relentless grazing. The logistical challenges became immense. Housing for a rabbit the size of a small dog had to be constantly upgraded. Her food consumption became a significant line item, requiring a steady supply of fresh greens, vegetables, and hay that would have been sufficient for a whole warren of normal-sized rabbits. The White House staff, already tasked with the smooth operation of the executive mansion and the care of the other Kennedy animals, now had to manage what was essentially a livestock animal with a fondness for floral destruction. The situation evolved from charming anecdote to a genuine and increasingly humorous problem. The juxtaposition was irresistible. Here was the administration that was navigating the Cuban Missile Crisis and launching the race to the moon, simultaneously grappling with the escape attempts of a super-sized rabbit with a taste for expensive landscaping. Ultimately, a decision had to be made. While Caroline was undoubtedly fond of her oversized friend, it became clear that the confines of the White House, even its expansive grounds, were no longer a suitable or practical home for such a large and active animal. For the sake of the rabbit's own well-being and the survival of the White House rose bushes, the Kennedy family made the choice to relocate Zaza to a more appropriate setting, likely a farm or a zoo where she could have all the space and food her heart desired. This humorous chapter in Camelot's history is so much more than a simple story about a big rabbit. It serves as a perfect, quirky metaphor for the Johnson-Kennedy relationship itself. LBJ, the larger-than-life vice president, had a habit of creating situations that were sometimes difficult to manage, his gifts and his gestures often coming with unexpected complications. The Kennedy White House, for all its grace and intellect, sometimes found itself navigating the unpredictable and occasionally overwhelming consequences of his well-meaning but monumental generosity. Zaza the rabbit was a living, breathing, and constantly eating symbol of that dynamic, a giant, delightful, and ultimately unmanageable present from a man who never did anything on a small scale. From the sprawling Texas ranch of Lyndon Baines Johnson came a menagerie that was as outsized and unpredictable as the man himself. While he is often remembered for his beagles, him and her, or the armadillos that occasionally roamed the grounds, one of his most revealing animal companions was far smaller and arrived not as a gift but through a chance act of rescue. The story goes that President Johnson, while walking the vast acreage of his ranch, came across a young squirrel that had been badly injured, likely from a fall or a run-in with a predator. Instead of leaving the creature to its fate, a side of LBJ that the public rarely saw came to the forefront. He carefully picked up the injured animal and brought it back to the ranch house, where he and his family nursed it back to health with painstaking care. They fed it with an eyedropper, kept it warm, and tended to its wounds until it was strong enough to move on its own. But this squirrel, which he simply named Squirrel, never really left. It had imprinted on its rescuer, and in doing so, it revealed a profound layer of Johnson's complex character that stood in stark contrast to his bulldozing political persona. This was not a pet kept in a cage for show. It was a free-roaming wild animal that chose to stay, and its behavior was nothing short of extraordinary. President Johnson would often hold impromptu meetings on the porch of the Texas White House, discussing weighty matters of the Vietnam War or the Great Society with aides and advisors. In the middle of these intense conversations, Squirrel would frequently appear, scamper up the president's leg, and perch comfortably on his shoulder, chittering softly or nuzzling his ear. The image is almost surreal, one of the most powerful and often intimidating men in the world, a president known for his fierce temper and his relentless, domineering style. The so-called Johnson treatment, sitting perfectly still with a tiny, trusting squirrel on his shoulder. He never shooed it away or seemed annoyed by the interruption. Instead, he accepted it as a normal part of his day, sometimes even absently stroking the animal with a finger as he continued to talk strategy. For the aides present, it was a bizarre and disarming sight, a moment where the formidable LBJ was transformed, however briefly, into a gentle caretaker. This relationship was a perfect metaphor for the duality of Lyndon Johnson. Publicly, he was all sharp elbows and relentless ambition, a political force of nature who could bully, cajole, and charm to get what he wanted. He was the architect of a devastating war and the driving force behind some of the most compassionate and sweeping social legislation in American history. He contained multitudes of contradiction, immense cruelty and immense kindness, towering ego and deep insecurity. The squirrel on his shoulder represented the hidden, nurturing side of that equation. It was a connection that required patience, quiet, and a soft-touch qualities he wasn't known for in the political arena, but that were nonetheless a genuine part of his being. Caring for a vulnerable creature offered him a form of unconditional acceptance that was utterly absent from his political life, a respite from the constant battles and the growing public scorn over Vietnam. In the trusting eyes of that small animal, he wasn't the controversial president, he was simply the man who had saved its life. The bond also spoke to Johnson's deep, fundamental connection to the land of his birth. He wasn't a city politician who found a squirrel novel or exotic. He was a man from the Texas Hill Country who understood the rhythms of the natural world. His relationship with Squirrel wasn't about domestication or ownership, but rather coexistence and mutual respect. He allowed the animal to retain its wildness while offering it sanctuary, a philosophy that mirrored his own view of government, a powerful force that should offer a helping hand but not control every outcome. The fact that he allowed this private, peculiar friendship to play out in semi-public view suggests a certain pride in it, an acknowledgement that this softer side was a real and important part of who he was. In the end, the story of LBJ and his squirrel is one of the most humanizing anecdotes from his presidency, a tender counterpoint to the turmoil of the 1960s. It reminds us that even the most formidable and complicated leaders have pockets of gentle humanity, often revealed not in grand speeches, but in quiet moments of care for the smallest and most vulnerable among us. While President Johnson found quiet companionship with a wild squirrel at his Texas ranch, the official White House residence during his term played host to a much smaller, faster, and far more numerous source of chaos. Beyond the beagles and the occasional ranch animal, the Johnson family included a colony of white hamsters, a seemingly conventional pet choice that proved to be anything but predictable. These tiny, industrious creatures were a favorite of Lucy Baines Johnson, the president's younger daughter, who adored their soft fur and twitching noses. They were housed in what was assumed to be a secure cage, a miniature world of spinning wheels and wood shavings that should have contained all their adventures. But these particular hamsters possessed a collective genius for escape and exploration that would become legendary among the White House staff, turning the most secure building in America into their own personal obstacle course. The escapes were not occasional, they were a constant, delightful plague. The hamsters, with their sharp teeth and boundless determination, were Houdinis in fur coats. They could gnaw through seemingly solid plastic, find microscopic gaps in wire mesh, and somehow navigate the complex latches meant to keep them contained. Almost weekly, the quiet hum of the executive mansion would be punctuated by a cry of, "The hamsters are out again." This announcement would trigger a full-scale, albeit tiny, search and rescue operation. Staffers, Secret Service agents, and family members would all drop what they were doing to get on their hands and knees, peering under priceless antique furniture and behind heavy draperies, trying to catch a glimpse of a tiny white blur scurrying for cover. Their destinations were as creative as their methods of escape. One might be discovered happily nesting in a First Lady's fancy hatbox, having shredded a delicate lace veil to create a perfect, cozy bed. Another would turn up in the kitchen pantry, its cheeks stuffed to comical proportions with pilfered dry pasta or oats. They were found curled up in the toes of shoes left by doors, nestled in the pocket of a suit jacket hanging in a closet, and on one particularly memorable occasion, one had somehow managed to climb into a grandfather clock and was discovered napping peacefully amongst the pendulum weights, its gentle snores in time with the rhythmic ticking. These weren't just escapes, they were carefully planned expeditions to the most luxurious and unexpected corners of the house. For the hardworking and often stressed White House staff, these recurring escapades could have been a tremendous nuisance. Yet the hamsters had an inexplicable charm that disarmed even the most formal usher or the most serious Secret Service agent. The sight of a towering, stern-faced guard trying to gently coax a frightened hamster out from under a sofa with a piece of cheese became a familiar and heartwarming scene. These tiny fugitives brought a necessary and universal dose of levity into an environment perpetually thick with the tension of the Vietnam War and the immense pressures of the Great Society agenda. Chasing a hamster provided a few minutes of pure, simple, and utterly absurd focus, a mental break from the weight of the world that rested on the shoulders of everyone in the building. President Johnson himself, a man known for his volcanic temper and relentless drive, was reportedly more amused than annoyed by the tiny intruders. He understood that they brought his daughter immense joy, and he seemed to appreciate the sheer audacity of their constant bids for freedom. In a way, these little white hamsters, with their relentless energy and their refusal to be confined, were a perfect, if bizarre, reflection of the Johnson spirit itself, uncontainable, unpredictable, and always moving. Their presence was a testament to the fact that even in the most powerful home on Earth, life finds a way to be wonderfully, messily, and hilariously normal. And just when you thought the White House couldn't get any more unpredictable, we arrive at an administration known for its profound complexity and a pet story that is, in its own quiet way, perfectly symbolic. The presidency of Richard M. Nixon was a study in contrasts, a man of immense geopolitical vision who was also deeply insecure, a leader who connected with the silent majority, yet often seemed isolated himself. It is against this backdrop of a carefully managed public image and intense private turmoil that we find one of the most curiously practical and unassuming entries on our list, the president's temporary pet lobsters. The story begins not with a whimsical gift or a child's request, but with a simple matter of logistics and taste. President Nixon had a well-known fondness for fresh seafood, a preference rooted in his California background but also echoing a certain East Coast sensibility. As a gesture of goodwill and perhaps a nod to his political base, a supporter from Maine sent a shipment of live lobsters to the White House. These weren't intended as companions. They were very clearly destined for the presidential table, a gourmet ingredient waiting for the pot. They arrived in a large crate packed in seaweed and ice, their claws pegged shut, their fate seemingly sealed. But then a delay occurred. Perhaps the schedule for a planned formal dinner shifted, or maybe the first family simply didn't feel like a lobster feast that particular week. Instead of being immediately dispatched to the kitchen, the lobsters were given a temporary stay of execution. To keep them fresh, they were placed in a large bathtub in the White House residence, their seawater environment maintained to ensure they remained alive and succulent for their eventual purpose. And for a short, bizarre period, the most famous bathroom in America became a makeshift lobster tank. This is where the line between pantry and pet began to blur. It's impossible to keep living creatures in your home, even in the bathtub, without developing a certain awareness of them. The lobsters, in their own stoic, crustacean way, became temporary residents. They would slowly navigate the porcelain landscape, their antennae twitching, their armored shells clicking softly against the sides of the tub. Staff members and family alike would peek in, not at ingredients, but at these strange, ancient-looking animals that had suddenly taken up residence. There's even an anecdote that suggests the president himself would check on them, a moment of quiet observation utterly divorced from their ultimate culinary purpose. For a brief time, they were not food, they were fascinating, if temporary, tenants. This entire episode is a remarkably apt, if unintentional, metaphor for Nixon's own character and his New England-inspired practicality. There was no sentimental attachment here, no naming them or considering a permanent reprieve. The lobsters were always understood to be a food source. This reflected a no-nonsense utilitarian worldview. A resource was to be used, but it was also to be respected and maintained properly until that time. Keeping them alive in the bathtub wasn't cruelty. It was the smartest, most efficient way to preserve quality. It was a deeply practical solution from a man who often prided himself on his pragmatism over emotion. Furthermore, the choice of lobster itself spoke to a certain identity. While Nixon was a Californian, the lobster is an indelible symbol of the Northeast, of a rugged, self-reliant, and traditional America that he frequently invoked and appealed to. Serving them would have been a signal of refined, established taste, a connection to an older, more patrician America. Yet, the image also carries a darker, more haunting resonance. The lobsters, living on borrowed time in a confined space, completely unaware of the fate that awaited them, can't help but feel symbolic of the trapped, paranoid atmosphere that would eventually engulf the Nixon White House during the Watergate scandal. They were creatures in a gilded prison, their every movement limited, their existence contingent on the whims of a powerful and inscrutable force. The bathtub, a place of cleansing, became a holding cell. In this light, the story transcends a simple oddity and becomes a poignant, unintentional preview of the isolation and impending doom that would mark the end of his presidency. The clicking of their shells against the porcelain becomes a faint, eerie soundtrack to an administration that was, itself, living on borrowed time. Following the turbulent, claustrophobic atmosphere of the Nixon years, the White House needed a reset, a calming presence to soothe the national nerves. And in a wonderfully unexpected twist, that sense of quiet tranquility would be provided not by a traditional dog or cat, but by a creature that lived its entire life in a silent, watery world. President Gerald R. Ford, tasked with the immense burden of healing a nation fractured by the Watergate scandal and the end of the Vietnam War, found an unlikely source of personal solace in a small, elegant aquarium stocked with Siamese fighting fish. This was a pet choice that defied all convention, reflecting a man who, despite his reputation as a clumsy football player, possessed a deep and often overlooked appreciation for quiet, orderly beauty. The fish, known for their spectacular, flowing fins and intensely vibrant colors, deep blues, fiery reds, brilliant greens, were a world away from the boisterous dogs that had characterized previous administrations. Their care was a ritual of meticulous precision, a daily practice that offered the president a much-needed mental respite. Unlike a dog that needs walking or a cat that demands attention, the fish required a different kind of engagement. President Ford took a personal interest in maintaining their environment, ensuring the water temperature was perfectly regulated, the pH levels were balanced, and the tank was kept scrupulously clean. This wasn't a chore delegated to staff. It was a hands-on hobby for the president, a small, controllable world where his attention to detail yielded immediate and visible results. In the midst of political battles over inflation and energy crises, here was a realm where order could be achieved simply and beautifully. The Siamese fighting fish, or Betta splendens, are fascinating creatures with a unique biological trait that makes them particularly suited to a solitary life in a small tank. They possess a special organ called a labyrinth, which allows them to breathe atmospheric air directly from the surface. This adaptation is a necessity in the oxygen-poor, stagnant waters of the rice paddies and slow-moving streams of their native Southeast Asia. For President Ford, this might have served as an unintentional yet powerful metaphor. His administration was the nation's gulp of fresh air after the suffocating moral stagnation of Watergate. He was, in a sense, the labyrinth organ for a country struggling to breathe again. The very nature of the fish, their ability to thrive in still waters by reaching for the air above, echoed his mission to help the nation rise above its recent past. Observers of the time noted that the president would often spend quiet moments in the evening simply watching the fish glide gracefully through their tank. In the mesmerizing, slow dance of their fins, the constant political noise of Washington seemed to fade away. There was a meditative quality to this observation, a form of aquatic therapy that allowed him to decompress from the relentless pressures of his office. The fish demanded nothing from him but basic care. They offered no opinion on policy, voiced no criticism, and asked for no favors. Their silent, graceful existence was a gift of pure, undemanding calm, a living art installation whose only purpose was to be beautiful. In a building often filled with tension and heated debate, the gentle filter hum of the aquarium provided a soothing backdrop, a pocket of peace meticulously maintained by the most powerful man in the world. This unconventional choice of pet revealed a private, contemplative side to Gerald Ford, a man who found strength not in grand gestures, but in the quiet, orderly maintenance of a small, beautiful world, one perfect tank at a time. Moving from the tranquil, contained world of Gerald Ford's fish, we arrive at an administration defined by its down-to-earth humility and a firm commitment to doing what was right, not what was flashy. President Jimmy Carter, a former peanut farmer from Plains, Georgia, brought a no-nonsense practicality to the White House that extended even to the matter of presidential pets. While they had a cat and a dog like many families, they were presented with an offer that was anything but ordinary. In 1977, the government of Sri Lanka, hoping to foster goodwill with the new American administration, extended a gift of truly monumental proportions, a live, young pygmy elephant. This was a classic gesture of international diplomacy, a magnificent and awe-inspiring creature meant to symbolize the rich natural heritage of the island nation. For many leaders, the sheer spectacle of accepting such a gift would have been irresistible. Imagine the headlines: President Carter welcomes baby elephant to the White House. The public relations value alone would have been immense, creating a wave of positive press and public fascination. The Carter children and grandchildren would undoubtedly have been thrilled, and the animal would have become an instant celebrity, drawing crowds to the fence just as the sheep and Rebecca the raccoon had in decades past. But Jimmy and Rosalind Carter were not like many leaders. Theirs was a presidency consciously stripped of imperial pretension. They carried their own luggage. President Carter famously wore a cardigan sweater to encourage energy conservation, and they prioritized moral clarity over political spectacle. When this extraordinary offer landed on their desks, they considered it not through the lens of publicity, but through the twin filters of practicality and compassion. Their first and most immediate concern was for the well-being of the elephant itself. Pygmy elephants, while smaller than their African and Asian cousins, are still enormous, intelligent, and socially complex wild animals. They require vast spaces to roam, specialized care from expert veterinarians, and the companionship of their own kind. the confines of the White House grounds, even with the best intentions, would have been a profoundly inadequate and lonely prison for such a creature. It would have been a life of exhibition, not a life of fulfillment. Furthermore, the Carters were deeply aware of the immense logistical and financial burden that would fall onto the taxpayer. The cost of constructing a suitable enclosure, heating it through Washington, D.C.'s cold winters, and providing the hundreds of pounds of fresh food and specialized care the elephant would need every single day would have been astronomical. For a president so focused on streamlining government and being a responsible steward of public funds, accepting such a costly gift, however well-intentioned, would have been a violation of his core principles. It was the very definition of a white elephant, a possession that is more trouble than it is worth. Yet the Carters also understood the importance of diplomatic courtesy. To flatly refuse the gift could have been seen as an insult to the people and government of Sri Lanka. So they crafted a characteristically thoughtful and practical solution. They expressed their deep gratitude for the generous offer, but politely declined to accept the elephant for the White House. Instead, they proposed an alternative that served everyone's best interests. They worked with the Sri Lankan government to arrange for the young elephant to be sent directly to a zoo. This wasn't just any zoo. It was carefully chosen to ensure the animal would go to a facility with the expertise, space, and resources to provide it with an excellent quality of life, and crucially, the company of other elephants. This decision was a masterclass in quiet, principled leadership. It respected the spirit of the diplomatic gesture while prioritizing animal welfare and fiscal responsibility. It demonstrated that the Carters' compassion extended beyond human concerns to the ethical treatment of all creatures, recognizing that a wild animal is not a trophy to be collected but a living being with complex needs. In saying no to the spectacle, they said yes to what was truly right, ensuring the elephant could thrive while gracefully strengthening a diplomatic relationship through mutual understanding and respect. This small, almost forgotten episode perfectly encapsulates the moral compass that guided the Carter presidency, a steady, unwavering commitment to practicality, kindness, and doing the difficult thing over the easy, popular one. While the Carters made a principled stand against a potentially impractical pachyderm, the next White House resident couldn't have been more perfectly suited to its environment or the image of the man who owned it. As the nation moved into the 1980s, President Ronald Reagan embodied a new kind of American confidence, one deeply rooted in a nostalgic vision of the nation's past, a vision of rugged individualism, wide open spaces, and the enduring spirit of the frontier. And nothing symbolized this persona quite like the animal that became an unofficial mascot for his presidency, a donkey. Now, this might seem like a paradox. After all, the donkey is the enduring symbol of the Democratic Party, the opposition. But for Reagan, this wasn't about politics, it was about authenticity. His donkey, named either Cleo or Baby, depending on the source, was no political prop. She was a working ranch animal from his beloved California retreat, Rancho del Cielo. This wasn't a pet that lived full-time in the White House. Cleo's home was the sprawling 700-acre ranch in the Santa Ynez Mountains, where she was a vital part of the daily rhythm of ranch life. She was a constant companion to the president during his cherished breaks from Washington, often seen trailing behind him as he chopped wood or cleared brush, a living part of the pastoral scene he so carefully cultivated. The image was powerful and deliberate, the leader of the free world, a former movie star, finding his deepest satisfaction not in the halls of power, but in the simple, physical labor of a cattleman with a trusty donkey by his side. This was the core of the Reagan mystique, a return to traditional American values, a connection to the land, and a can-do spirit that resonated deeply with the public. But Cleo's story doesn't end at the ranch's fence line. In a delightful twist that blurred the lines between his private retreat and his public duty, the donkey occasionally received a special invitation to visit the most famous house in the country. On a few memorable occasions, Cleo was transported to Washington, D.C. and brought to the White House grounds. The sight must have been astonishing for tourists and reporters alike. The stately, manicured South Lawn, typically the stage for formal ceremonies and military pageantry, suddenly playing host to a calmly grazing donkey. These visits were never grand public spectacles. They were quieter, more personal affairs. They were often tied to holiday events or family gatherings, a way for the Reagans to bring a tangible piece of their California happiness to their official Washington home. The irony of a Republican president, the standard bearer for the party of the elephant, keeping a donkey as a cherished pet was not lost on anyone, and Reagan himself leaned into the humor of it. He was a master of folksy storytelling, and he would often joke about the situation, disarming potential criticism with a well-timed quip. He'd suggest that perhaps his donkey was a spy, or that she was there to remind the Democrats across the aisle not to take themselves too seriously. This good-natured ribbing was a classic Reagan tactic, using humor to bridge political divides and present himself as a genial, above-the-fray leader. It transformed a potential political oddity into a charming anecdote, a symbol of his ability to transcend partisan rancor with a smile and a wink. Ultimately, Cleo the donkey was far more than just an animal. She was a crucial piece of the Ronald Reagan narrative. In a decade of intense Cold War tension and rapid economic change, Reagan sold the American people on a story of renewal and traditional strength. The donkey, with its humble, hardworking, and unfailingly steady demeanor, was the perfect supporting character in that story. She represented the simplicity and authenticity he promised to restore. She wasn't a dangerous exotic or a diplomatic puzzle. She was a dependable, familiar creature from the American heartland, a direct link to the cowboy mythology that Reagan so skillfully embodied. Her presence, both at the ranch and on those rare trips to the White House, reinforced the idea that the president was, at his core, just a regular American who loved his country, his land, and the uncomplicated companionship of a faithful animal. In the end, the story of Reagan's donkey isn't about partisan symbols. It's about the enduring power of image, the comfort of nostalgia, and the surprising ways a simple creature can come to define an entire era. The serene, pastoral image of Ronald Reagan's ranch donkey gave way to a far more dynamic and often comically contentious domestic scene with the arrival of the Bush family. George H.W. Bush's White House was famously a warm, bustling, and informal place, filled with children, grandchildren, and a deep sense of familial love. And at the heart of this lively household were two animals who captured the nation's attention not for their harmony, but for their hilarious and seemingly irreconcilable differences: Millie, the impeccably bred English Springer Spaniel, and the Bush family's free-spirited cat, a stray tortoiseshell named simply, and perhaps prophetically, Kitty. Millie was more than just a pet. She was a bona fide White House celebrity. As the first dog, she had her own best-selling book, Millie's Book, which was purportedly dictated to the First Lady and provided a dog's eye view of life in the executive mansion, with the proceeds benefiting literacy programs. She was the picture of presidential decorum, well-trained, loyal, and frequently photographed at the president's side. She accompanied him on walks around the grounds, sat dutifully during important meetings, and became a beloved symbol of the Bush administration's wholesome, all-American character. She was, in every sense, an establishment figure. Kitty, on the other hand, was the ultimate outsider. She was a rescued stray who had wandered onto the Bush compound in Kennebunkport, Maine, and decided to stay. She embodied a completely different set of virtues: independence, cunning, and a glorious disregard for protocol. Where Millie was polished, Kitty was scruffy. Where Millie was obedient, Kitty was defiant. She was a creature of whim and stealth, often disappearing for hours only to be found napping in a laundry basket or surveying her domain from the top of a bookcase, far above the concerns of the political world below. This fundamental clash of cultures set the stage for an ongoing Cold War within the White House residence. The two animals did not merely ignore each other, they maintained a state of mutual suspicion and thinly veiled hostility that provided a constant source of low-grade drama for the first family and the resident staff. The tension was most famously documented in a series of photographs that perfectly captured their strained relationship. In one particularly iconic image, the two are lying on the same yellow rug in the West Sitting Hall, a seemingly peaceful scene. But a closer look reveals the truth. They are positioned as far apart as possible, their bodies angled away from each other, a palpable aura of disapproval radiating from both. It was a masterpiece of diplomatic distancing, a silent agreement to share the territory while making it abundantly clear this was not a partnership. The White House staff became unwitting mediators in this interspecies feud, constantly on alert to prevent skirmishes. An aide might be discussing foreign policy with the president only to have the conversation interrupted by a sudden hiss or a low growl from the hallway. The peace of the residence was periodically shattered by the thunderous sound of a dog chasing a cat through the corridors, a flash of brown and white fur pursuing a blur of tortoiseshell up a staircase or under a sofa. These spontaneous eruptions of chaos were a hilarious reminder that despite the immense power concentrated within its walls, the White House was still, at its core, a home subject to the same universal laws of pet dynamics found in houses across the country. The Bushes, to their credit, never tried to force a friendship that was clearly never meant to be. They accepted the drama with good humor, understanding that some relationships, whether between world leaders or family pets, are simply built on a foundation of respectful disagreement. This ongoing saga of the dignified spaniel and the irreverent cat became one of the most humanizing and relatable aspects of the Bush presidency, a daily soap opera that proved even in the most rarefied air, you can't choose who your family brings home. Of course, even a presidency as large and complex as Bill Clinton's had room for the smallest and simplest of moments, often sparked by the whims of a child. Amid the high-stakes political battles over healthcare reform and navigating the post-Cold War world, the Clinton White House was also a home, and it was Chelsea Clinton who often brought a sense of normal, adolescent wonder to its hallowed halls. One day, while exploring the lush, sprawling grounds of her unique backyard, she made a discovery that countless kids across America make every summer: a frog. This wasn't a rare species or a diplomatic gift. It was a common American frog, probably a bit startled to find itself scooped up by the first daughter. But to Chelsea, it was a treasure, a new friend, and she immediately pleaded to keep it. The Clintons, known for their relatively informal approach to family life in the executive mansion, agreed. And so, for a brief and delightful period, the most powerful residence in the world played host to this tiny, jumpy amphibian. An aquarium tank was likely procured, hastily converted into a makeshift terrarium with a small dish of water and perhaps a few leaves or a rock. This simple container, holding a creature that could be found in any nearby pond, became a quirky, temporary fixture in the family's private quarters. It was a far cry from the pygmy hippos and tiger cubs of administrations past, and that was precisely what made it so special. This frog wasn't a symbol of power or a token of international diplomacy. It was a testament to the fact that no matter how grand the address, a child's desire to connect with nature remains a universal, grounding constant. The frog's stay, however, was as temporary as the season. The Clintons understood the difference between caring for a domesticated animal and keeping a wild creature. A frog's needs are specific and instinctual. It belongs in its natural habitat, not a glass box, no matter how well-intentioned the caretakers. After a short time, allowing Chelsea the experience of observing and caring for her find, the decision was made to release it. One can imagine the scene: a walk back to the very spot on the south lawn where it was found, a gentle release and a hop back into the freedom of the grass. This small act was a quiet lesson in responsibility and respect for the natural world, that sometimes the best way to care for something is to let it go. This humble frog, whose name wasn't even recorded for history, represents a beautifully mundane counterpoint to the exotic extravagance of so many other presidential pets. Its story needs no dramatic arc of international intrigue or logistical nightmare. Its charm lies in its sheer simplicity. It reminds us that presidential history isn't just made in the Oval Office or the Situation Room. It's also written in these small, domestic moments: a parent indulging a child's curiosity, a family learning a lesson about nature, and a fleeting connection with a wild thing that briefly hopped into the orbit of the most powerful family on Earth. In its own quiet way, the frog's brief residency is a perfect metaphor for the Clinton era itself, modern, informal, and punctuated by moments of genuine, down-to-earth humanity amidst the relentless pressure of the global stage. While the Clinton White House found whimsy in a temporary frog, the presidency of George W. Bush traded amphibious subtlety for a symbol of unmistakable Texas swagger. From his 2,000-acre Prairie Chapel ranch in Crawford, the president introduced a living, breathing emblem of his home state to the national stage, a longhorn steer. This was no ordinary pet. It was a moving monument to Texan identity, a creature whose sweeping horns and imposing presence spoke of wide open spaces, rugged independence, and a deep connection to the land. Unlike pets that lived full-time in the executive mansion, the Longhorn's primary residence remained the ranch, but on special occasions, this magnificent bovine ambassador would be transported to Washington, transforming the manicured elegance of the South Lawn into a temporary slice of the American West. The visual impact of these visits was nothing short of spectacular. Imagine the scene: against the pristine white backdrop of the most famous house in America, a creature built on a monumental scale calmly grazes. Its polished horns, which can span an astonishing 6 to 7 feet from tip to tip, curve gracefully against the green grass, creating a surreal and powerful image. This was a deliberate and masterful piece of political theater, but it was theater rooted in genuine authenticity. For President Bush, the Longhorn wasn't a costume he put on. It was an intrinsic part of who he was. He was a genuine rancher, a man who found solace and clarity in the physical labor of clearing brush and tending to his land. Bringing the Longhorn to Washington was his way of sharing that core part of his identity with the nation, a tangible link between the rugged values of his ranch and the polished power of the presidency. These bovine photo opportunities were far more than just quirky publicity stunts. In the tense and fearful years following the September 11th attacks, the image of the Longhorn on the White House lawn took on a deeper significance. The animal, with its immense strength, quiet dignity, and unshakable steadiness, became an unofficial symbol of a nation determined to stand its ground. It projected an aura of resilience and unwavering resolve, a message that America, much like the iconic Longhorn, was tough, enduring, and not easily moved. For a public grappling with uncertainty, this simple, powerful symbol offered a sense of comfort and steadfastness, a reminder of the nation's foundational strength. Of course, the logistics of hosting a 1,000-plus-pound steer on the South Lawn were as complex as they were comical. The White House grounds crew, more accustomed to aerating lawns and nurturing rose gardens, suddenly had a new and very large responsibility. The primary concern was, to put it bluntly, waste management. The Longhorn, being a healthy herbivore, produced an impressive quantity of droppings, a reality that required a dedicated clean-up detail to follow closely behind the presidential pet with shovels and buckets. This behind-the-scenes effort ensured that the symbolic grandeur of the moment wasn't undercut by the more fragrant realities of ranching. Secret Service agents, trained to assess threats from every human angle, now had to factor a large, unpredictable animal with pointy horns into their security calculus. monitoring its movements to ensure it didn't decide to explore the rose garden or test the structural integrity of a historic hedge. Yet, for all the practical challenges, the Longhorn's presence was a brilliant public relations success. It provided a wonderfully humanizing counterbalance to the image of the president as a wartime commander. Here was the same man who stood atop the rubble of the World Trade Center and addressed the nation from the Oval Office, now standing in the sunshine, scratching the neck of a gentle giant. It showcased a multifaceted leader who could project iron, resolve on the global stage while still maintaining a rancher's touch with the land and its creatures. The Longhorn was the perfect bridge between his two worlds, the ultimate symbol of Texas, temporarily imported to the heart of Washington, D.C., to remind everyone of the enduring, unpretentious, and powerful spirit of the place the president called home. And finally, our 30th and final entry brings us to a pet so perfectly of its moment, it almost feels like a modern art installation commenting on the very nature of presidential companionship. While the Obama White House was famously home to the much photographed and beloved Portuguese water dogs, Bo and Sunny, it also briefly hosted a far more discreet and contemporary resident, a small lizard. This wasn't a grand diplomatic offering or a rustic throwback to a ranch. It was a simple domestic decision made by the first daughters, Malia and Sasha, that spoke volumes about evolving attitudes toward pets and the informal, modern family dynamic the Obamas brought to the executive mansion. The story begins with a desire common to countless children, the wish for a pet. But instead of a dog or a cat, the Obama girls set their sights on something more unusual, a creature that reflected a newer, more eclectic trend in pet ownership. The exact species of the lizard is lost to time. Perhaps it was a common leopard gecko or a small iguana, but its impact was immediate. A terrarium was set up, likely in one of the family's private quarters, a self-contained little ecosystem of heat lamps, carefully regulated humidity, and tiny bowls of water and food. It was a world away from the sprawling, chaotic menageries of the Roosevelts or Coolidges. This was pet keeping on a smaller, more manageable, and arguably more thoughtful scale. The presence of this tiny, cold-blooded creature in the White House is a fascinating footnote in the long history of presidential pets precisely because it was so unremarkable in its context. There were no frantic newspaper headlines about a lizard on the loose, no political cartoons lampooning the choice, no logistical nightmares involving the sourcing of live crickets for its meals. It was simply accepted as a normal part of a modern family's life, a reflection of how the definition of a pet had expanded far beyond the traditional dogs and horses to include reptiles, amphibians, and insects. This quiet acceptance signaled a significant cultural shift. The White House, often a lagging indicator of societal trends, had finally caught up with the times, recognizing that a child's connection to the animal kingdom could be just as profound with a scaly friend as with a furry one. The lizard's tenure, however, was brief. As many parents of children with unconventional pets will attest, the initial excitement often wanes when the daily realities of care set in. The specialized needs of a reptile, the specific lighting, the temperature control, the particular diet likely proved to be more than a passing interest for two busy young girls with school, friends, and the unique pressures of growing up in a global fishbowl. The responsibility, as it so often does, may have gradually shifted to the White House resident staff, a dedicated team already tasked with the immense job of running the nation's most famous home. Recognizing that the lizard deserved consistent, expert care, the Obamas made the practical and compassionate decision to rehome it, ensuring it went to a family or facility better equipped to meet its needs long-term. This small, almost ephemeral chapter is a perfect symbol of the Obama presidency's relationship with tradition. They respected the history of the building they inhabited, the portraits on the walls, the weight of the office, but they also infused it with their own contemporary, relaxed style. The lizard was a quiet rebellion against the expectation of what a White House pet should be. It wasn't chosen for its symbolism or its publicity value. It was chosen because two kids thought it was cool. In that simple act, the Obamas democratized the concept of the first pet, reminding the nation that the most famous address in America was, at its heart, still a home where children could make requests, parents could indulge them, and life, in all its wonderfully normal and sometimes fleeting ways, would always find a way to carry on. And so our wild tour through the White House menagerie comes to a close, from alligators in bathtubs to hyenas on the lawn, from a squirrel on a president's shoulder to a lizard in a terrarium. This isn't just a collection of quirky trivia, it's a unique lens through which to view American history itself. These animals were more than just companions. They were silent witnesses to pivotal moments, fuzzy and feathered reflections of the presidents who kept them. The stoic, isolated Andrew Johnson finding solace in feeding mice by hand tells us as much about the man as any political speech. The rugged, adventurous spirit of Theodore Roosevelt is perfectly captured in the chaotic glory of his private zoo, just as the quiet, contemplative nature of Gerald Ford is revealed in his meticulous care of Siamese fighting fish. These creatures humanize figures often seen only as marble monuments, reminding us that behind every monumental decision was a person who might have been worrying about a raccoon ransacking the gardens or a hamster loose in the West Wing. They served as diplomatic tools, political symbols, and sources of national comfort during times of war and crisis. From the entrepreneurial sheep of Woodrow Wilson to the resilient longhorn of George W. Bush, these animals have been woven into the very fabric of the nation's story, offering moments of levity, wonder, and unexpected insight. The story of the presidential pet is ultimately a story about connection, to the natural world, to the public, and to our own humanity. It reveals that the desire for companionship, the curiosity about the world's creatures, and the occasional impulse to embrace the wonderfully weird are traits that persist even in the highest office in the land. Now we want to hear from you. Which of these bizarre historical pets captured your imagination? Was it the dignity of Pauline Wayne the cow, the audacity of Rebecca the raccoon, or the sheer improbability of a pygmy hippo on the South Lawn? Share your favorite story from the list or one we might have missed in the comments below. Let's keep this delightful conversation going. And if you enjoyed this journey into the stranger side of American history, be sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. We're always digging up more unbelievable stories and weird facts that you won't find in your average textbook, and we'd love for you to join us for the next adventure.